Hello, it's Dr. Brian McDonough, and welcome to the Dr. Brian McDonough Show. I have a very special guest today, Paul Gluck. We'll be talking with Paul Gluck in a moment on the Dr. Brian McDonough Show.
The Dr. Brian McDonough Show.
I've done everything I can so you don't take me seriously at the top. We have the 90s theme music, we have the tuxedo. I feel like I'm about to sing at some Atlantic City club, and we do all.
It's a good look for you, Brian.
I want to welcome Paul Gluck to the show. I'm going to go back. I'm going to show a little picture of Paul Gluck from days where I believe you're at KYW at this point.
Okay.
KYW
Yes, I was there, and 4 of my extra chins were.
I see you. I see legendary Larry Kane. I see Scott H Sherman. I do not know who this is.
That is a wonderful producer, but who now teaches at Penn, by the way, named Joanne Kaplan, who came to us. There's a story behind her. She came to Philadelphia in a solid gold Cadillac after we hired her away from, I believe it was ABC News. She had been working at, and she was the executive producer and co-creator of the Bulletin.
Wow,
it was a great show.
Bulletin was an amazing show, which Larry did. And Scott H Sherman, as I call him, I owe my broadcasting career to him because he somehow, I don't know why, gave me a chance. I sent him emails and begged for a job, and he made me work for it, but it was great.
Well, despite the fact, that he hired me, he has great taste and talent. He was the director of news at KYW TV, and I was the executive editor, so I was sort of his number 2. And it was one of the best experiences of my life just to work with Scott. He's a friend to this day. Most anyone who's worked with Scott continues a friendship with Scott. The question for you, Doctor, is what does the H in Scott H Sherman stand for?
I don't know.
Hunt. Hunt.
I don't know. That's great. See, that you were close to that. You killed me. You killed me publicly. I have to tell you now, I'm going to play something for you. First of all,
but you would know his A1C. I know his middle name, so
I do know A1C. That's right. 46 years I have you in the business. You started out as a production assistant at KYW TV.
Yep.
Gone to WJZ as an executive producer down in Baltimore.
It wasn't quite that easy a jump, but a few interim jobs. But yeah, place to place was KYW, then WJZ.
And I actually tried early on because I was working in St. Francis in Delaware to try to get on the air at WJZ. You may not have been there then. Maybe you were. Maybe you just said this guy's not worth it. But anyway,
no. I would have remembered you, and I was there from 77 to 81.
Okay, so I would probably have come there around 86.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
but
I was back here by then.
I have you at 88 as a news director at WCAU TV, and then
first news director job. Yeah.
The executive news editor at KYW. Then you became news director, and then of course you moved to WHYY as the director of news and public affairs, and now you're actually teaching a whole new generation of broadcasters as associate professor in media studies and production at Temple. And also, are you presently the president of Natus? Or
no, I'm a past president. I sit on the board at the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences Mid-Atlantic chapter. Right. So I'm very fortunate to have been a part of that organization, which recognizes and celebrates excellence in media for probably 30 years. I sit on the board of the Philadelphia Broadcast Pioneers, though I haven't broken my hip yet. And God forbid. And I'm been on the educational committee at the Philly Ad Club for a while.
Wow!
So, and this is all fascinating work to me. I don't know what I bring to the table other than an overhanging belly, but the opportunity to work with those organizations and to continue relationships with people who've been friends and peers for decades is wonderful for me. And we also, by the way, we refer to the people we teach now as the next generation of multimedia professionals.
Yes.
We're not allowed to call them broadcasters anymore.
No, you're right. In fact, I want to feel, and not to make this turn into this is your life, but listen to this. I was playing this, like what you may remember from broadcasting. I was going through that. That was the KYW theme from the mid '90s
Oh yeah.
television, and and it's funny. Like for those who are younger, and I'll put it in perspective. My oldest is 30, and they knew I was on TV. They knew I did stuff, but all of a sudden I became important when OJ resurfaced in the case against OJ, and they saw that I was hosting a segment. I was actually anchoring a segment during the OJ case because like there was the chase going on. It was like going on forever. So they said, "Well, we'll put Brian McDonough in there," and I talked about the psychological impact, what's going on, and we're all filling time. And my daughter said, "Wow, you were important," and I go, "Well," but it's hard for this generation to understand that there were like 3 or 4, maybe 5 stations. That was it, and everybody watched those.
Yeah.
And you were a news director at that time, where like the impact of what you would put on the air had it had tremendous impact. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I was very blessed and fortunate to be able to be news director for the first time in my own hometown. So I was and there's a minor story that'll get you there. I was the late news executive producer at Channel 10, which in 1988 was a CBS owned and operated television station before we had made the station switch for NBC from between channels 3 and 10. So I was at a place where our sons were relatively young, and I was in what we call in our family Uncle Daddy mode. It was like they knew me, but I wasn't home enough because one of the rewards in television still is you work the late news, which has probably the largest available audience because of what your network's prime time hands to you and what you cultivate. So I'm talking to my wife, the late news EP, and I'm like, you know what I'm going to do? I think it's time I found something else. I want to be home in the daytime. And I started talking to some other stations about freelance work very quietly, talked to someone at Temple about maybe being an adjunct, and figured, well, if I can put these two things together, we can at least, eat Ritz crackers and government cheese every night. I won't necessarily be wealthy. But so I go into work to tell my boss, Jay Newman, who was our director of news, that I'm probably going to leave now, and here's as much notice as I can give you. While I look for a job, you can figure out who you want to promote, or hire. And I didn't get in the door. I went to the entrance on the side of the old Channel 10 building on City Avenue, and the general manager was waiting for me, Steve Cohen. And I thought to myself, okay, at least I'll get a severance. He doesn't normally wait for me at the door. Something's not good here. And he goes, I need to see you. So I figure, okay, well, I don't. What have I done this week? I go in and he said, you have any interest in being director of news here? And I said, I've never done that job. Nobody's better at talking themselves out of something good for themselves than me. So I followed that with, believe it or not, I heard it coming out of my own mouth. My wife does our checkbook. I've never done a budget. And I'm thinking like, well, moron, why don't you think up 50 more reasons you shouldn't have this job?
Exactly right.
So he says, Jay doesn't know it, but he's going to be named director of the station we've just acquired in Miami. Or no, not news director, station manager, the number 2 position in the station. We're conducting a search, but I didn't want the search to end until you and I talked. I think you might be able to do this job. I sort of blinked, and I got the job. So 1988 was a very different time. It was sort of very emphatic. We were in news expansion. Everybody was adding another fill in the blank.
Exactly.
Another half hour to the evening, another hour to the morning. Suddenly, weekend morning news. Even your alma mater, Fox 29, I believe, was in the business of doubling their weekend evening news from 30 to 60 minutes.
Exactly. They started at 10. Exactly.
Right. So, right. And I believe it was like 1985 or 86 that Channel 29's version of the 10 o'clock news started in this market.
Right.
So we've seen all this vast expansion, and some of it was because it became very expensive to buy off-network programming some of these are business decisions. Became very expensive to buy off network programming. It was cheaper to expand local news. Plus, you keep all the ad revenue when you expand local news. You're not sharing it with the syndicator or the network. Technology grew at a rapid rate. Suddenly, not only were we able in the mid 70s, when we sort of became able to be live anywhere we wanted to be within a certain area through the use of microwave trucks and field ENG, electronic news gathering technology. Now we're talking about ready availability of satellites for distant coverage of stories. Stations are getting sat trucks. Channel 3 had one. WHYY had one that they rented to other stations. So that all was very kinetic, and the emphasis and the stakes in news raised rapidly. That's my memory of the time. I also would tell you because as you said, there were limited opportunities and sources for news for the consumer. You were not getting, at that point, you weren't getting it on a pager. You weren't getting it on a smartphone because there wasn't one. I remember my first cell phone was pretty much issued to me as director of news at Channel 10. It was a bag phone, so I could take it wherever we went, though it had sort of dicey coverage. I can remember the technician who assigned it to me saying, "Don't let your kids near this thing. We don't know much about these phones," which made me feel comfortable. But I didn't want my kids or me near it. And the thing that struck me was in terms of audience availability. I don't know why I remember this, but the last rating book where I was news director at Channel 10 would have been in early 1991. And that's when I left to work with Scott at Channel 3. We were number 2 with a 27% share of the audience at 11 o'clock. And I think WPVI may have had 33 or 35%. I don't recall what KYW had. And at that point, I don't think Channel 29, because it was an hour off from us and hadn't started an 11 o'clock newscast.
4 or 5, yeah, at the best, yeah.
So they weren't rated with us at that point, I don't think. They were rated at 10 o'clock.
Sure.
So, today, to see any station victorious with 5% share, 3% share, 2% share, it speaks to the fractious nature of available audience and the other platforms in which they're gathering. But just one thought: what we didn't realize was one of the biggest battles we had once I got to Channel 3, Scott and I had, with retaining audience, the battle to retain audience, was that we're thinking, well, are we losing it to all these new cable options, to ESPN, to CNN? I don't think Fox News was up on its feet yet, even though they're powerful in cable to this day. And I don't believe there was an MSNBC yet. But we're all like, where's this audience going? And what we discovered was at 11:15, they were going to bed. They weren't going to other video. The audience, whether it was our audience or WPVI or WCAU, they were having a hot toddy and checking out.
I remember the 10, we were worried about Jerry Springer. Like
sure.
Jerry Springer, he was syndicated with that crazy show. People were turning to Jerry Springer, and you're like, well, how do you compete with that? And I remember, because I always, like, even though I was a doctor in broadcasting, I loved all the background information and always followed it. And I looked at it and said, wow, this is amazing. And you could see the change. And then I remember A Current Affair coming in and all these shows. And I thought, well, that isn't news. I mean, I was told, give both sides of my story. There's not both sides. Do this, do that. And here we are now. And that's what I want to ask you about. I was, obviously I'm totally, as much as you can be my age and understand social media, I'm looking at Twitter, I'm looking at this. And I saw the other day, it was dramatic. Don Lemon had interviewed, I think, the press secretary for President Biden, and had asked a question, which I think was a reasonable question that I would have asked 25 years ago. Do you think the president could run in 2024? Will he be healthy enough, mentally stable enough? That's a reasonable question.
Yes.
But I looked at the Twitter response, and it was like, why is Don Lemon asking this? I would have expected this from Fox. I would have, and I thought, oh my goodness, if this is a dramatic example, like it's no longer objective news. It is, we want this out of this station, we want
Right.
this out of that. They're going for ratings, they're going for numbers, they're going for drama. And where has news gone? Where has news coverage like you saw gone? When you're teaching young professionals, like, are they just trying to grab the 2% they can and make the money at any cost? What's going on?
I think there are a variety of issues at play at once. I think what you saw is sort of in the case of Don Lemon, and I know Don Lemon wasn't. This is no criticism of Don Lemon, but he wasn't the first to ask that question, and he certainly wasn't the last. I think you see people who feel very strongly about President Biden encircle him. And I don't know that he needs their help. I'm just saying they encircle him in an almost protective way because he engenders that in those who support him, the way perhaps Donald Trump does in his supporters. So I think that's one piece of it. I think as a nation, there are a couple things at play. We are a culture without context. Whatever story just happened is the big story. The story, you know what, and we'll get back to that other story, maybe. But what so we have everything sort of comes right up here, like it's consuming the windshield of your car. And so that's one factor. We're tribal in our use of media. We've picked our own, our own camping ground. So if we are to the right, we're going to watch largely Fox. If we're to the left, we're going to watch largely MSNBC. There are a lot of centrists who look at CNN, but so many think CNN's listing to the left. Hold it, the left, my left. But see, this TV thing. So I think what I've seen is there was a time that at 6:30 at night Eastern time, 3 network evening newscasts told you what the news was today. David Brinkley, who for many years was the anchor of first the Huntley Brinkley Report and then NBC Nightly News on NBC, once said, "News is what I tell you it is." That bothers me because I'm not so sure we're incapable of defining what's important for us as viewers. But by the same token, now news is sort of this. It's almost a palette of, okay, we need a little green here, so this is breaking news, and we need a little orange, so this is human news, and we need it. It almost becomes formulaic to the point that perhaps some stories that should be on the air aren't on the air, and some are playing the political game. I think it's intriguing to me that NBC, which is often accused of left-wing bias across their platforms, um, has in their portfolio CNBC, which I believe is a robustly, it's certainly not right wing, but it is, it's a free market channel.
But if you're a big business person,
Right.
like you're Rupert Murdoch or whatever, hey, get every order. Like you don't really care. Have your left, have your right, have your mid.
Right.
Make the money, and that's my concern. Like when I look at it, you're right. I look at it and think about. I remember going to one of these physician broadcast conferences, and it was a producer for Walter Cronkite, and way back, and he said one day it was a Saturday afternoon. They were trying to come up with a lead story, and somebody said, "Hey, there's a potential for a beef shortage." And Cronkite said, "Let's go with that." And they did a beef shortage story, and it became a major problem for like 6 months, a major economic problem because CBS had covered that. But it was almost a whim, like we're looking for something for our show tonight. Well, that's real. And then, like, so there was too much power for those
Oh
three
yes.
networks. But now you're at the point where it's like it's almost a gratuitous attempt to please your audience. You have a Tucker Carlson saying one thing, a Don Lemon saying another,
Rachel Maddow saying something else.
another, and what we're seeing is the media is driving and potentially can impact people, leading them to violence, to rage, to these things, and like how as a news person, like you've seen it evolve, and you're teaching young professionals. how do you control that, or should you control that? I mean, is it just let it happen, or what do you do?
Well, I don't. I'll speak for me and nobody else. I don't sit in the room and say, find your audience and only give them the information they want. My view is varietal. My view is a well-informed human being, a well-informed American citizen, viewer of any channel, has to have these elements to understand their day. But it is not mutually exclusive from other important components to the newscast that might arise beyond your anticipation. So that the job is to have sort of this periscope into culture and also be able to react when something you can't anticipate occurs, evaluate it. I've always believed, and I've been taught by some wonderful mentors, um, everything in news does not have the same weight. If you've created a newscast where everything weighs 60 pounds, it doesn't. Some stories weigh 8 ounces, some weigh 60 pounds.
You have to have your squirrel and the skis
Right.
across the pond or something.
You really have to have some sense of the context of the audience. First of all, you have to know your audience as best you can. And I think sometimes in the zeal to recruit audience, because ratings equal revenue, um, some things get on the air that maybe are of high entertainment value, but not always of, and by the way, I'm as guilty as any other news director of that, high entertainment value, but not necessarily of the highest significance in journalistic value to the viewer. But we pretty well settled into our echo chambers on TV and on cable, certainly, and in social media. The difference, I think, with social media is they're yelling back at you. If you were to ask me what I think are the greatest challenges, certainly to local news, which has been my forte through the years, I think local news is sort of flying itself into a wall every day. I was in the generation that wanted to be able to scream "This just in," breaking on Channel 10, whatever.
Right.
But we had a measure. If it was more than an hour before we went to the air, we wouldn't call it breaking news. At
Correct.
least in my 1/20th of a millionth of whatever the history of those stations where
Well,
I
and
worked.
I agree with you because, like, if you watch, I'll just pick CNN. Like, I'm on the treadmill usually at 6 o'clock, and I get home and I put on Wolf Blitzer, and it goes breaking. I think the show's called Breaking News. It's
One of their shows is called Breaking News.
breaking news every day at 6 p.m. It's bizarre.
Well, it occurred to me one night, when there were three channels and three network choices, we experienced something in America called brand loyalty. So I grew up in an NBC household.
Right.
We watched the Today Show. We watched the Huntley Brinkley Report. We certainly appreciated Walter Cronkite if we switched the channel, or if somebody, hit the remote when they were trying to reach for dinner. But so you have this sense of brand loyalty. So I to this day, I watch Lester Holt at 6:30. I just happen to think I kind of like the way they write, and I like their sensibility, and I like their, all of that.
Sure.
And then one night, I don't know, 3, 4 weeks ago, I'm sitting here. My wife Eileen and I have dinner together here in this dining room, as they would say on TV, in a dining room much like this one.
We should.
We have dinner. We have dinner together with Lester. We always joke we're having dinner with Lester tonight. So the first block of NBC Nightly News that night had 7 stories. The second block, I believe, had 5 stories. All 12 were labeled as breaking news. And I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, how is that? And I don't, believe me, I don't think anybody at NBC is in any way duplicitous or disingenuous. It's clearly something that's become sort of the predicate of building a newscast. Well, we have to have some breaking news, which was not different than my time in local. So now I'm seeing the network decide that a story that maybe happened 16 hours ago is breaking news. Local news, this penchant for labeling everything breaking, everything as though it has just happened seconds ago, I think can impede the viewers trust. I think writing with a certain level of false immediacy and urgency uh, can certainly be off-putting to a viewer. And it's people in the business always want to yell, consultants do it. Well, the consultant isn't there every day. That I know. I've worked with consultants. I'll tell you a great consultant story from WJZ in a minute. But I so it's not like the consultant can put a gun to the news director or the general manager's head and say, "Do this because I said so." Now,
Right.
those two people may want to make sure that the consultant who's there in behalf of perhaps the division president listen carefully to what the consultant says. But the choice to not do a feature, but to go do one more story about violence, a story that may not have context, a story where we're simply breathlessly reporting that we're live on the scene, something happened. Damn if I know what it is, but we're going to find out. And clearly somebody got shot. And at least it's not in your neighborhood. We'll be back with more. I mean, and I know I exaggerate that, but
No, I see what you're doing. Yeah, but that's
you decide, okay, I can have a really good feature, or we can decide we're going to spend a minute and 20 seconds on that. I think that is discouraging viewers from coming. I think uh, stations that want to live on that edge are pushing viewers away. And I think stations, I'll just say this, I think stations that hold a more, I won't say conservative and certainly not politically conservative, but traditionalist view of what constitutes news, like WPVI, maybe WLS in Chicago, WNBC in New York. Those stations, I think, tend to become market leaders and cultivate and retain audience because there is a sense of trust there.
well, you know,
That
it's interesting.
there's something that says this seems real.
A few weeks ago, I had a chance to interview Jim Gardner. He's retiring. We were talking about that. And when you look at it, I go, wow, like I've been on KYW since 1988, which is an amazing run.
Yes.
But he was on he was on WPVI in like 76.
Yeah.
He's still on WPVI. He's been number one. And I said, what is your success? And he said, we just tried to tell the truth. We tried every day to tell the truth and do the best we could. And you look at that and go, that's what works.
Well, and it does. The problem that the other stations have is that it works. They still have an obligation to grow audience. By the way, and obviously sometimes it's for bragging rights, but largely it's because the home office is looking for ratings, recognition, and revenue. The three R's. And so other stations have been led to do either do we do sort of ersatz action news because we know that works, but why leave action news as a viewer to see sort of surrogate action news? That lesson's been learned in this market. Channel 3 has probably had the most experimentation. When Scott and I got there, they were very sort of in the mode of what Eyewitness News was born to be at Channel 3, which is stories about people reported by folks who have some vesting in the community, who are not necessarily impaneled inside the studio. They go to, they go interact with the community. And they were doing fine. And Group W said Group W Westinghouse Broadcasting was then the owner of Channel 3. And the view was we can't sit here forever and let PVI win and not have any piece of the market to call our own, even though, by the way, at that point, great talent. Diane Allen had been there, Pat Shiraki. I'll speak well of Jerry Penacoli. I thought he was a very good anchor.
Absolutely.
And Linda Joanella was doing weather. It was sort of a well-structured situation. And Scott and I were charged with working with others within the company to develop something totally different. And what we came up with was 3 different shows, not branded, through the day, but one show had one brand, another had a different. The late news was 11 at 11. Give us 11 minutes, we'll tell you everything you need to know, including weather and sports. And I would say Scott and I both had a sense 10 minutes into this that the second worst place a newscast can be is ahead of the curve. the worst place a newscast can be is behind the curve.
Okay.
But when you're messing with something for which the audience may not be ready, and I'm not one of those people who thinks the audience are trained seals. I've listened to more than one consultant and media manager talk about the audience as though somehow they're leading them. Well, what they don't understand is the audience can pick a winner. That's their choice. So, we looked at that and thought, well, and then if you fast forward 5 or 6 years later, stations across the country started to have success with a variant of that format. To this day, Channel 29 does 10 at 10, with 10-minute bursts of information, and they do it well. But I mean, you sort of look and go, well, okay, if all the attributes that satisfy the audience needs live at WPVI, honest, accurate, engaging reporting, excellent talent, by the way, and never underestimate, people joke about the graphic look. I think the look of the newscast influences a viewer's choice. I think if it's a bright, depending upon what you're delivering, if you want something dark and filmic, A Current Affair was great for that. If you're doing that kind of tabloidy show, we're your friend, we're your neighbor, we want to help you, we're bright, we're colorful. Diversity is a key, by the way, which is something Channel 6 has worked very hard on. They have a general manager who, in full disclosure, is a friend of mine, and he's Bernie Presenica, Temple alum, by the way, who's, I think, been incredibly thoughtful in the way he's
Well,
recruited.
I've always said, I mean, in fact, I mentioned this when I talked to Jim. I said, look, I'm a doctor who got into the media business and loved it, but I look at KYW News Radio, I look at Action News, and I go, what is consistent? It's consistent because it's consistent. They didn't get a new person, a new flavor of the month, a new
Right.
change. They didn't panic. They stayed with what they had and they built it. So I knew that Hank Spurka was there. Dan Cuellar was there. You could name the names. And I look at Channel 3, I look at Channel 10, and you start to build a relationship and boom, they're gone. And then you're like, well, I invited someone into my home and they're gone. I'm going to go with Action News because they're there. And I always remember, talking to Roger LeMay at Fox and at Channel 29. I said, if you just stay with the same people in Philadelphia, this market, different than LA, you'll do well.
Sure.
And if you think about it, you still have Mike DiNardo, and you could go right down the line at KYW, even myself. Like, people know who they know, and in a town like Philadelphia, they trust that. And I don't think the consultants get that. I've also, in healthcare, I'll tell you, in healthcare and hospital management, in television and radio, I think consultants usually have kind of had an issue with the job they had and they went into consulting. And I always thought, why do they spend so much money on a consultant? And my view is because you can blame the decision on someone else as opposed to your own decision. I'm a news director. Well, the consultant said this. It gives you a layer of protection.
Yeah. Although in the end, it doesn't. That's the funny thing. I've known a dozen news directors who are like, well, I can say it was the consultant. And I've said to at least 6 of those 12 news directors, no, because the consultant's sitting next to the general manager or the division president going, it's the news director.
Right. So follow your heart. Exactly. Yeah.
The thing I would just say is the people who I've seen, and some of them are of great intent, who've come to the market, general managers and news directors, and it's kind of like, we're going to do it the way we did it back in fill in the blank, Boise, Mackinac, wherever they came from, without understanding how it works. By the way, Wilmington was a huge lesson for me when I got to WHYY.
Oh.
I had no idea that a raid, and I'd known the station, I'd watched the station, but I was the guy from Philly, so already they were sort of concerned that, like, I didn't understand or care about Delaware. And because I lived that life of working in Baltimore and in Philly, it wasn't just an Amtrak stop for me. I knew Wilmington, but I learned great lessons about the importance of politics in programming, of opinion in Wilmington. It is for what people on the outside would look at Delaware and Wilmington in particular as sort of a quiet place. It's not. People are opinionated. They have very strong feelings about what's theirs and what Delaware should be. That was a lesson that I learned the hard way, thinking, well, I'll import some of this stuff from Philadelphia news, and I knew 10 seconds later, no, we're not doing that anymore.
Practiced three decades in Wilmington. The only break I get is I'm married to a woman from Wilmington. That gives me a little bit, but
Little cred.
from there, you are correct. It's local, and they know, like, where did you go to high school? Where did you go to grade school? Where are you? And that determines things. And I realized, just say you're not from Wilmington, full confession, and then say, but I really like the place. You'll be better off than if you try to pretend you know. And you're right. I mean, but Philly was the same way. It's very provincially. You almost have to say where you're from. I want to shift a little bit though, because I want to talk about you. You have like
I'm so ugly, so that's solved. What else do you want to see?
well, you achieved. I mean, you went to the highest level of as a news director, as a programmer, and now you're teaching. Like, what do you see the future of the media? And as you said, it's more than just media. There's so much more to it. What do you see the future in your eyes? Because
Well,
you're working with young people and you're seeing what's happening.
what somebody said the other day, what do you do for a living? And I said, I talk about television with people who want to be in television but who don't watch television. That's sort of, well, I have a couple of thoughts about it. One of them, by the way, is that I also have one other job at Temple besides teaching. I teach a TV production course. I teach a history of electronic media because apparently I'm the only one in the building old enough to have seen all of it. But I also run Temple's citywide cable channel, Temple University Television,
Mhm.
which gives us in the truest sense of the term, a broadcast laboratory to sort of experiment on some things. So there are a couple of my colleagues in the journalism department who do what they think is the next generation newscast. It moves a little faster, but it tells longer stories in between those moments of fast pace, and that seems to satisfy viewers. Um, we don't have ratings measurement, but I think anyone who looks at that at a show called The Temp, we have the more traditional newscast that is, we're very honored to say, has won um, student awards from the Emmy chapter. Temple Update. It's been around for, I guess, almost 30 years, if not more. Founded by the late Rick Beardsley, God rest his soul. So I sort of have to look at that as the laboratory. But I watch companies like CBS and NBC um, and their affiliates and their owned and operated stations. Everybody tries something interesting. Everybody wants to put something on Snapchat. Everybody wants to put something on cable. Everybody wants to put something on Instagram. I know there are network news divisions working with TikTok. Um, for me, the future is, and the only way I could justify a future in journalism is the quality, continue to seek quality in content. Now, that's a moving target. Is it more people, less people? Is it story appropriate? This story requires that you see it through the eyes of 5 involved people, victims, or people who've triumphed, or is this really a story about government and it won't make sense without the chancellor and this one and that one? So some of it is cultivating that sort of discrete sensibility that says, what's going on here? How do I tell that story? Now, how many ways can I tell that story? So when I've captured, it's funny, we had a meeting about this today with a colleague who was a high-ranking editor at the Inquirer for many years, Arlene Natoro Morgan. And I said, if you think about what's next, and you draw it in concentric circles. So here is at the core, here's content, right? And then you just put rings around it. Digital platforms, social media, streaming, cable, um, off-air broadcast, something that hasn't been invented yet because we have to have a circle for that. And you say to yourself, all right, now I have 5 or 6 different points of entry into a particular story for a news consumer.
Hmm.
But whatever that story is, the story is the mayor of Philadelphia defies the state and the feds and signs an executive order to stop assault weapon sales in the city. This is not a true story. I want to be clear about that. But
Okay,
I'll make that up.
but you're hypothetical.
It's
Yeah.
a hypothetical. So that happens. And okay, now how are we telling this story for people who are fully vested in the politics of it? How do we tell this story for people who just want to understand what safety is? How do we tell this story for people who may be vested in the idea that police services aren't what they should be? How do we tell that story in a way that it does or doesn't deal with social issues in the city that are greater than who bought the weapon and where? So, and one of those stories, maybe the right place for that one story is Snapchat. Maybe the other right place for it is on a website. Maybe the other, maybe one is a social brand or a digital brand. One's on TV. One's in print somewhere. So for me, the future is taking Story X, figuring out which platform can help somebody have a better understanding or appreciation of the story, and then crafting the content to that platform. It's not a smaller future. A lot of people a few years ago were like, well, TV news is done. It's baked. It's cooked. One of the few residual effects of the pandemic was local news viewership went up. I can't say revenue went up. There weren't a lot of sponsors left at that point. Well, for a while. But people were turning back because they found that there was verity, there was honesty by a local source for news, rather
It's
than waiting.
it's fascinating what you're saying, because my view, like if somebody said to me, "What's your future of news?" and no one has asked me because they're not going to ask a family doctor, but what's your view of news? I said, I don't think you should try to be a multi-newscast with many stories. I said, every day you should do a story, and you should do a story and attack it exactly the way you're saying through all the different aspects of
Right.
media, and you do one story well. That's all you do, and you have a whole team doing one story well. So it could be AK-15s one day. That's your story, and you do it everywhere.
And it could be vaccinations the next day, and it could be watershed in the Delaware Valley the next day.
Or or it could be, or you could do it on the local level and do it that. What's your local story? And I think that would have more value because most people only have 5 minutes for it. I mean, they don't have the attention span they used to. So give it up and just admit it and do that well. I think there's a chance something like that could succeed because you would pick it up across all medium. But again, that's my view. Um, but a lot of
I
people,
don't think it's a bad view. I think, and by the way, some of what I came to after we visited NBC News 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and they were at that point very much into a team approach to news coverage.
mm,
So there is at NBC News, there's a consumer team. And that means that maybe 2 or 3 correspondents on that team, one of them is going to take care of the Today Show and Weekend Nightly, and one of them is going to take care of Tonight's Nightly, and one of them is going to take care of NBCnews.com and whatever they have on Twitter.
that's actually very bright. Yeah,
And what I'm suggesting is, okay, if one team can do that, and your room is filled with 6 teams, and you may have to commit to what those genres of coverage are.
you could do 6 or 5 stories and do them all the
Right.
same way.
And then, sports, and then um well, I think we've beaten weather silly in our business. Although um I will never be negative about my friend Kathy, or she can be on the air all day long as far as I'm concerned. But and Sue Serio. But the thing I would say is, if you have the resource and the mobility to be able to take and identify teams and say, well, that clearly falls into the science team. That clearly, falls into the consumer team. However you identify them, there's probably a way to do that, and then the presentation has to be more contemporary. And the thing that intrigues me about the length of storytelling, because I am of that generation of news person who was sort of like, well, this can't be more than a minute and 24 seconds. What the hell's the matter with you?
I saw Roger LeMay. We had a reunion the other night. He said if anybody could take a 1:30 and drag it into 4 minutes, it was you. And he was still giving me grief. And I was laughing hysterically because, in his mind, it was like, you were killing me. I don't need 4 minutes on blood flowing through capillaries.
Well,
And
no,
I had to
no.
learn how to shorten it.
But you know something? The growth of NPR tells me there's an audience for longer form programming. The
Mhm.
success that Vice has had tells me there's, and it's probably a younger audience for longer form programming. But also, I don't think you poke tradition in the eye. If KYW News Radio started to sound like NPR, I think people
Right.
would
Yeah,
walk away from it. There's a different expectation there.
you can make again in Philadelphia. You can make subtle changes. Maybe you can have an orchestra do the KYW thing, but you can't go too far away, right? I mean, that's really what it is. And even in my case, 45 seconds. Keep it at 45. And if it's important enough, we'll expand it, but don't drag it out. It's something that works.
In terms of people on camera in this town, there are kind of two things that are married in their way. Time and grade. You talked about Hank Spurka. We could talk about Vernon Odom or Bill Baldini or Robin McIntosh or Dick Sheeran or Pat Cherokee or anybody who's been here. Kathy Gandolfo, who retired a few years ago. I think there's the sense of there are people who truly believe that Larry Kane is a native Philadelphian. Larry was born in Brooklyn, grew up in Miami and Los Angeles, but his time in grade in Philadelphia, and I believe he anchored from 1966 or 67. He didn't anchor Action News until 1970 when they debuted the format, but he was a weekend anchor. And I think I want to say he retired in the 90s at Channel 3. But
NBC, CBS, ABC.
right,
Yeah.
but people would say he's a Philadelphian. I know that Larry's from Philly, and because there were some peculiarities in his speech, he sounded it. If you want to get Larry, ask him to say birthday. And police has no O. It's just police.
He's
We
gonna
call the police.
down the road. We're gonna have a conversation because he's about 80 now and talking
Yeah,
about the Beatles
and still working at KYW News Radio as a
yes,
special correspondent covering politics.
still do it. Yeah.
And I believe offering his advice to the NBC television stations.
Mhm.
So you sort of so time and grade is important, and I think one of the things that's been well proven is the term I've always used is approachability. People would walk up to Pat Cherokee at I don't know if your audience knows, but Channel 3 used to be across from Independence Hall with KYW News Radio, and walk out of that building on a weekday, and two things were going to happen. Somebody who was down visiting the mall from a Philly neighborhood would walk up to Pat and all but embrace her. I watch you every day, hun. I love you. She generated that in people, as does Alicia Vitarelli today. I suspect. I don't know Alicia, but there are a lot of people who evoke that response. The other thing you would learn on any weekday at Independence Mall is a busload of school children would get off a yellow bus and sing the KYW jingle, which I experienced once. It's like phenomenal when a 7-year-old looks up and goes, KYW News Radio.
You can't ask for more. I know. I remember Roy Shapiro, who was the general manager when they hired me way back in 1988. He said, "Your life will never be the same in Philadelphia once you're on KYW because
Right.
it was a week. It was literally in a week where I was playing tennis and somebody said, is that Dr. Brian McDonough?" And I'm like, wait a minute, like, how did they know my voice? It was that fast, and it was that. And and somebody asked me about that. I said, "Well, I've written a story every day since 1988 on health." They go, "Every day." I go, "Yeah, every day." I said, "It's been going on." I said, "But you have to in broadcasting, you have to have the luck of being with a station that survives, a format that survives, and you have to be lucky enough that they, for whatever reason, keep you." And that's how it works.
I'm also a big believer in management diaspora. There, in the sense that if you were to put a chart on the wall that starts with Lorne Michaels as the creator or co-creator of Saturday Night Live, and comes to this afternoon in American comedy, you can track his diaspora. You can see who he influenced, who he hired, who he showcased, who he
Yes,
helped. Roy Shapiro was one of those people. His diaspora is felt today. I think David Yadgaroff, who manages this market for
absolutely.
the company that Group W became along the way, Odyssey, would and has in my company credited Roy with so much of what he's able to do with people. Lou Klein, who is one of the legends of Philadelphia television and national television, the creator of American Bandstand, uh, the man for whom the Lou Klein College of Media and Communication is named at Temple. And I'm one of about 18,000 people whose advice I sought and received. His diaspora is everywhere in television, certainly local television, and as one of the founders, I believe, of the National Association of Television Programming Executives. He's had influence across the board on people who run networks. So that's an important piece of it, that somewhere along the line, there was somebody with clear eyes and a cool head making decisions at a station that ultimately became
And we
successful.
talked about Scott Hunt Herman.
Scott Hunt Herman is one of those people. You can
And
find his diaspora everywhere.
you look at it, and it's amazing. One last question. Oh my gosh, we've talked for an
Sure.
hour, and it's been fascinating. It's gone so fast.
Forgive me. Well, my
How
apology.
do you see as maybe your greatest contribution, and what do you see as, I'm not going to say biggest failure, but you wish you had done differently? What would those two things be?
Well, we'd be here for 17 hours if I talked about the things I wish I'd done differently. Greatest count. I have to say, one of the things that really I look back on in my career, and I'm really happy I was a part of, and had some role in helping to devise, was the Bulletin with Larry Kane, which was the market's first 60-minute television news magazine. Other stations had done 30-minute versions of it, but and with Joanne Kaplan, who we started this conversation about, a brilliant producer that we were able to hire from New York, who loved Philadelphia. That was key. She didn't walk in the door and say, "Well, here's how we do it at ABC." She embraced Philly, and it embraced her. The Bulletin was incredible fun. Um, Things I wish I'd done better. I wish I could have been a little more patient with some of the things I did. I wish I would have taken a breath and said, you know what, maybe this isn't terrible. Let's do more of this. Um, I've walked into as many walls as anybody could in this business. I've done as much stupid stuff, if not more than most. But I can't sit there and say there's one thing I screwed up. I have a whole mosaic of things I screwed up. But I think doing the Bulletin, anytime I've spent doing live TV, is the greatest fun in my mind.
Wow.
I don't know why, but there's something about I was I always say that with all love and respect to Temple, my alma mater as well as my employer, the greatest school I ever attended was WJZ in Baltimore, because we were the 20th market. We were big enough to be real, but small enough to make some mistakes. I worked with brilliant talent, and most of us were young. It was a bonding experience, like being in the service or in a fraternity or sorority. The things we did there were fun because nobody was telling us we couldn't, and we tried a lot. Um, I'll say a couple of things about TUTV really quick, and not as a plug. Um, uh, we sort of made it our business. I was blessed to be able to launch the station with significant funding from the Rudman Foundation. Cal and Lucille Rudman, rest their souls. And that gave us the ability to sort of do some grown-up stuff. So things I'm really proud of in this part of my career. Because we didn't know we couldn't do it, we sent 5 kids to London to cover the 2012 Olympics. It did 7.5 hours live from London because we were too stupid to know Skype could fail. So thank God it didn't. We did the Democratic National Convention here, not for political preference, but because it was here. A year before that, maybe, the Pope came to Philadelphia. We did 37.5 hours of live coverage of the Pope with our students as the field reporters. Our friend Amy Caples and Luann Kahn anchored, but our students were the field crews, reporters, and it got us to a place. We partnered with Channel 6, and we wound up as a rare collegiate CNN affiliate. There are very few of us who are college TV stations that are CNN affiliates. So that got us the chance to let our students anchor from the skybox at the convention. We like to believe that we're at our best when we bite off what we're not sure we can chew. And it came home for me one morning when I was just trying to get into my office. 3 students banged on my door, and I'm like, "What?" Because I'm always warm and friendly with them that way. And Notre Dame Cathedral, it's burning, right? Yeah. Well, we have 2 students who are studying abroad in London, and they have gear.
Yeah.
If we get them to Paris, would you pay for the CNN uplink? And I'm like, yeah, what are we talking? So anytime you have the privilege of working in an environment like that, where the students are so anxious to, a place of experiential learning, but where the students are anxious to do what they want to spend the rest of their careers doing, that's a privilege, and it's fun.
Buddy, Scott H. Sherman, he comes up again, made fun of me forever because
Oh yeah,
right after
college radio.
right
I
after
heard it.
right after med school, I started doing a talk show on Temple Public Radio. Did it for 20 years, and because I'd gone to Temple, and he always said, "You're still doing the Temple show." I know he got it, but he would always tease me. I go, but there was always another 3 or 4 students who were helping, and there was always 3 or 4 more students who were learning, and I was learning from them and watching them grow, and people who have become Bob Monick, others. They worked on this show, and I look back on it, I go, that's why I did it, because it's the same reason I taught residents all these years. If you give to the future and they see it as fun, they see it as exciting, it makes them excited. And I can tell you have that passion, and maybe your greatest contributions. I mean, despite everything you did in TV, which was wonderful, in traditional broadcast media, you probably are doing so much more for the future generation. So,
No, I hope so. By the way, not to give short shift to public television, 2 real kicks at WHYY. The elevation of St. Catherine Drexel,
mhm.
Nancy Karabjanian, my
Oh,
friend,
that's great. Yeah,
Queen of Wilmington Television,
Dude,
Delaware Television.
she's
She
Wilmington.
was. She also, the night that she said she was leaving to go teach at UDel, I put out a memo that said the only time Nancy Karabjanian could ever disappoint me behind an anchor desk was the night she told me she was leaving. Incredible professional. So Nancy, I think, anchored our coverage of the St. Catherine stuff, which we did with Rai TV in Italy. And then a night where Tracy Matisak and Marty Moss-Cohen
Yeah.
hosted from the theater at the Hotel DuPont, adjacent to the Hotel DuPont. It was an evening with Desmond Tutu. He had come to speak in Wilmington. And that was an extraordinary night. It was electrifying. And we covered that live. And I have to say, we covered the opening of the Kimmel Center live. It was the first time I believe Channel 6 ever partnered with another station. But that was just a kick and a half to do that live, the opening. It was the orchestra's first performance.
All these connections. You mentioned Tracy Mattis. I remember my very first story at Channel 29 before it was Fox. It was Barbara Bush's thyroid. And I had to do this story, and no one told me what to do. So I'm like, what do you mean I have to write a lead? What do I have to do this? What do I have to do that? And she sat down with me. She said, all right, I want to help you. Like, they just threw me into the fire, said, do it. And I always remember that. You remember when someone takes your hand and says, I'm going to help you. And it only needed that little bit of help, but it meant so much. And from then on, working with her, or even to this day, watching her, you want nothing but great things. And of course,
Well,
she's just a wonderful person. So,
and I was going to say, and who else would you expect to walk over and go, "Can I help?"
yeah.
Besides Tracy. I mean, there aren't that many Tracys in the newsroom.
No. Well, Paul, thank you so
My
much
pleasure.
for taking the time. This was so much more. I knew it was going to be fun, but it was so much more fun than I thought it was. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join.
It's my pleasure. It's always my pleasure to be in your company. You are a beloved and honored person in our family. My wife Eileen still appreciates the advice you gave her some years ago when she was having some health issues, and the
Love the fact
kindness you've shown us is always remembered.
she's still doing well. And I will tell you, this business can be tough for families and people, but you've always put that as a priority, and I can tell, and I watch it, and I think you enjoy your family and your kids more than anything, and you have it in the proper perspective. And
And
now
7 grandchildren. You want to see where my hair went? I have 7 grandchildren.
I have my first. He was over this afternoon, and he's 6 months old, and was ripping the glasses off my face, and I was never so happy.
I love them all. At any rate, Brian, thank you for having me. I guess I'm supposed to say the opinions expressed are those of an idiot, so please don't take me seriously. But thank you for inviting me.
And
It
I will
was a
give
pleasure
you
for me.
the theme song on the way out.
The Dr. Brian McDonough Show.